Welcome to the Recovery.com podcast. Join us as we navigate the nuances of recovery, featuring heartfelt stories, expert insights, and the latest breakthroughs in mental health and healing. Whether you're taking the first step or continuing your recovery journey, we're here and hope to support, inform, and inspire you. I'm your host, Editor-in-Chief at Recovery.com, Dr. Mala Chaudhry Malgeri. I'm joined by fellow host and Chief Growth Officer at Recovery.com, Cliff McDonald. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Donald Meichenbaum, a pioneer of cognitive behavioral therapy and one of the most influential psychotherapists of the 20th century. As Distinguished Professor Emeritus and Research Director of the Melissa Institute for Violence Prevention, Dr. Meichenbaum shares his extensive knowledge and insights into resilience and mental health. I am so honored, Dr. Meichenbaum, to talk with you today about what expert therapists do and the core tasks of psychotherapy. So welcome.
Well, it's a pleasure being here. Thank you for your interest.
Of course. What inspired you to work in the field of mental health, rehab, recovery, and why is it important to you?
For a number of years, 45 years, I was a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And during this period of time, I had an opportunity to work with all varied populations. My original work at the University of Illinois started off with studying thought disorders in schizophrenics. I had developed there various kinds of self-instructional cognitive behavioral procedures that had some promise as an editing. I then moved to the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, where our initial work was once again working on cognitive behavioral interventions with hyperactive children, adults who had impulse control, and then eventually I ended up working on people who've had trauma experiences, post-traumatic stress disorder. So I've had over the course of my career a variety of clinical populations I've worked with.
That's amazing. Yeah. Could you share your insights on the fundamental skills that you believe define an expert therapist in the field of psychotherapy? What do you think is the most important quality for a therapist to have?
Well, clearly the research indicates that the quality and nature of the therapeutic alliance is 3 to 4 times more important than the specific intervention that's being used. So the one characteristic is the degree to which the therapist is able to develop, establish, maintain, and most importantly, monitor on a session-by-session basis the quality of their therapeutic alliance with the client. The therapist needs to be culturally sensitive, needs to be gender sensitive and age related in formulating the nature of the problem with the client. The second characteristic that I think is clearly important is to meet the patient where he or she is at. And this means that we have developed at various times a case conceptualization. It turns out that therapists who vary their intervention in the characteristics, meaning that of the client, are more effective than those who are showing a great deal of fidelity to a specific treatment protocol. Thirdly, it is critically important that the therapist and the patient develop some sense of hope. And the research by a number of investigators indicate that having collaborative goal setting is a very valuable tool in nurturing hope for the client. Those are 3 important elements. I could enumerate others, but those are the 3 that I think are critical.
Yeah, that collaborative approach is certainly one that I've used throughout my career, and it really does do wonders and is imperative as part of the process. So, in your
Yeah.
extensive experience, what core tasks of psychotherapy do you find most critical for facilitating meaningful change? How would somebody know that their therapist and they are a good match?
Clearly, the answer to that question is to ask the patient. The question is, how does one ask? So I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Scott Miller,
Mm-hmm.
Barry Duncan, Charles Shaw, and they've developed what is called feedback informed treatment,
Yeah.
and they have developed a variety of self-report measures,
Mm-hmm.
quick kinds of scales that could be used at the end of each therapy session that tries to enumerate whether there's a good fit between the patient and the therapist. I have developed two legacy courses of what I characterize as the experts of doing therapy.
Mm-hmm.
These are two 10-hour sessions. And in there, I have included the art of questioning.
Oh, one.
So if you do not want to ascertain the degree of fit using some kind of rating scale, there are a number of questions that you could ask of your client, well, it should be asked at the end of each session. And these questions deal with the degree to which the client felt that they were heard and respected, that they felt that the session addressed the issues that they want to address during that thing. There are questions that ask how and when the client is going to apply what he or she learned that session. The therapist cannot leave out or fail to address the issue of generalization, which is a key element.
Yeah.
What needs to go on before, during, and after the training of a skill that the patient is likely to use. And then there is need in subsequent sessions for the therapist to ask the patient on a regular basis the degree to which that particular skill makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add one more thing, if I might,
Absolutely.
and that of these various questions, the key question that I tend to ask my client is the following. I say to my clients, let me ask you something a bit different, perhaps even unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, the client, ever find yourself out there in your day to day experience asking yourself the questions that we ask each other right here?
Mm.
So it is my job to try and have the client take my voice with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is one of my favorite questions because I want the client to recognize that what's going on in the therapy session is a kind of modeling of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I want to put myself out of business. I want them to become, in some sense, their own
Right.
therapist. So, therefore, asking the questions, do they ever find themselves asking what we ask each other
Mm-hmm.
right then, is in fact one of the higher mental cognitive skills that I need them to
Mm-hmm.
develop.
Yeah. Yeah. That tool in and of itself has
That's
been
great.
formative in my approach and throughout my career. And it's 100% thanks to your teachings and your research. So, absolutely. Yeah. Cliff, I see your unmute button is off, so go for it.
Yeah, thank you, Mala. Dr. Meichenbaum, I'm not a clinician.
Okay.
Um, I've I've studied psychology a little bit in undergrad, and I did a graduate program in positive psychology. I am someone in long-term recovery from substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder. Um, and I didn't know this, but I had a fair amount of trauma and some volatility and violence growing up. When you talk about different populations and then therapeutic alliances, I had never seen a therapist until I was 47 years old. And that's when I, in recovery terms, I hit my bottom and I started my recovery. And it was amazing, this woman in 3 sessions, that she really, really understood me. And I felt safe with her and I felt like she understood me. How challenging is it, especially with these different populations and people that have experienced a lot of trauma and violence, if you've got a clinician that maybe grew up very, very differently, right?
Yeah.
Maybe middle upper class, maybe elite private schools, etc. I don't want to use the term street cred, but
Yeah.
how do those clinicians, how are they trained to be able to connect with someone who is from such a different environment? That seems really hard.
Well, I think that's a really good question. First of all, I should note that I've written a book called Treatment of Individuals with Substance Abuse that's out there that addresses many of the kinds of questions that you have to ask. Let me see if I can direct the answer directly to your question. I think that an effective therapist, no matter what their background, is effective insofar as they are able to show accurate empathy.
Yeah.
So they may not have a similar exact problem as you did, but they're able to identify with the pain, the emotional distress, with the past background that you have experienced. And they need to communicate that both verbally and non verbally during that first initial sessions. It turns out that the quality and nature of the initial therapeutic alliance by the third session is highly predictive of how well they're going to do over the rest of
Yes.
it. So the fact that this therapist, whoever he or she may have been, were able to communicate that with you. The second element is that not only do they need accurate empathy, they have to be able to engender a kind of sense of trust that you are going to be able to convey whatever the pain you have, the experiences you've had, and that they will respect, that they will honor it. And moreover, that inherent in their communication to you is not only a sensitivity to their risk factors, but to the protective factors. So the fact that at 47 you had quote unquote hit bottom means that you have come to recognize the sense of resilience and strengths that you had. So the fact that she's able to demonstrate accurate empathy, that she's able to engender a kind of trusting enjoyment, and thirdly, that she's able to give you hope in highlighting for you. And I would hope that this therapist would have asked you, how did you come to treatment now?
Mm-hmm.
After all of these years,
Yeah.
what share with me, the therapist, how you came to be in this office with me. And therefore, your answer to that question will enable me as a therapist, even though I haven't had the exact same experience, to be able to fit with you, I hope. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's perfect. It's beautiful. It makes complete sense. Dr. Meichenbaum, it makes me think. So I use the 12 steps, right? I'm sure you're familiar with
Okay.
the 12 steps from Alcoholics
Very, very
Anonymous.
familiar.
And many people recover with a sponsor. And a
Yes.
sponsor is an amateur therapist in many ways. And what we're coached to do as a sponsor, don't preach, don't tell, just share your experience, strength, and
Right.
hope. And when I can share how scared I was when I was in the throes of addiction and what happened to me, etc., you can see someone engaging because I think they identify and they see a similarity, which lets them feel at ease.
Yeah,
I'm sure you're
and
familiar with the sponsor relationship, right?
yeah, I am. And just like therapists, there are really good sponsors and poor sponsors.
Yes.
Yeah,
So I've
at
really
100.
become
There's no
really
barriers to
interested
entry.
in
Yeah, yeah,
the quality and nature of therapeutic alliance. I've spent many years. In fact, I'm right now in the midst of training psychotherapists in
Mm-hmm.
China. I assume Chinese psychotherapists. And the one kind of caution that I want to highlight, because I've lectured on this and written about it, is that the field of psychotherapy is filled with bullshit, or what I call hype or exaggerated claims of
Mm-hmm.
efficacy. And the last year or so, year and a half ago, with a colleague named Scott Littlefield, we wrote an article on how to spot hype
Mm-hmm.
in the field of psychotherapy. And if your listeners go to um, the agency I run, the
The Melissa.
if they go to the Melissa Institute for Violence Prevention,
Mm-hmm.
the www.melissainstitute.org, they will be able to read this hype article and become a more critical consumer.
Mm-hmm.
So there's certain kind of advice that I think a sponsor should give you in terms of relapse prevention, warning signs, metacognitive skills that you need. So many of the same personal attributes that make for an effective therapist make for an effective
Mm-hmm.
sponsor. And not everyone should become a therapist, not everyone should become a
Mm-hmm.
sponsor.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I'm sure you
absolutely.
can
Yeah, and
identify with that.
there's no barriers. Yeah, and there's no barriers to entry, or there's limited barriers to entry, unfortunately, for the
Mm.
sponsor. So thanks so much.
Yeah.
That was really helpful.
Yeah, the sponsor should undergo some
Mm-hmm.
training.
Yeah.
There's a whole set of procedures called motivational interviewing.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hope that sponsors go through that because one of the major tenets of motivational interviewing is to avoid argumentation.
Mm-hmm.
And no one's going to argue you out of your addictive substances. Okay? They need to have you explore the discrepancy between how your life is now and how you would like it to be. They need to support your own self efficacy when you, in fact, are tempted and no longer engage in your addictive behavior. They need to ask you questions of how or what. How did you do that? What happened? They need to get you to have some personal agency.
Mm-hmm.
So, my hope is that both therapists and sponsors will go through that kind of training.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great segue for one of my other questions about common misconceptions that about the work that therapists do and how they might differ from the actual reality of practice.
I think that there are certain kinds of skills that therapists need that I've commented on, and they have to be sort of person centered.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to have the exact same problems as their clients. Cancer doc doesn't not need cancer to be able to
Yeah.
relate well.
Mm-hmm.
I think the art of questioning is really your most valuable tool if you're a clinician, a therapist. The clinician needs compassionate curiosity. To your colleague, I need to understand what and how he developed his addiction. What purpose did it serve? If he's come to the decision to seek help, how did he come back? So, what and how did he make that decision? What would he like to see? How could I be of help to him?
Mm-hmm.
So, my compassionate curiosity is what I want to convey to my
Mm-hmm.
clients.
Right. So a misconception could be that you need to have experienced what the client, or another person, the client, has gone through. But to your point, you're saying that as long as that rapport and that passionate curiosity is translated into the sessions to be able to explore the person's life, then we're starting to make some distance and go the long journey.
Yeah, and mostly related to that is some clients come in and have the expectation of the therapist that they're going to tell them what to
Mm-hmm.
do.
Mm-hmm.
And I've come to a phrase called therapists should not become surrogate frontal lobes
I
for
love
the
it.
client.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Surrogate frontal lobes. It's not my job to tell the patient what to do.
Yeah.
Often the patient knows what to do, but they're not doing it. So
Mm-hmm.
I have to explore with the patient what are the potential barriers or obstacles that are getting in the way.
Mm-hmm.
What are the nature of the beliefs, the emotional feelings that are hijacking the frontal lobe?
Mm-hmm.
And I need them to become more aware. I need them to become their own therapist rather than just depend upon me giving them advice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Most patients don't take advice.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. So, with that, you mentioned, and I want to go back to this, that you're extensively training people and you're training people in China right now. Tell us a little bit more about that and what
Yeah.
that program involves and how you're integrating new technologies and approaches into your training methods.
I wrote a book called Roadmap to Resilience.
Mm-hmm.
I developed two legacy courses. About a year and a half ago, my wife was killed, and I have made that material available for free on the
Mm-hmm.
internet. So if people go to Roadmap to resilience.wordpress.com, maybe you could even
Yeah.
type that
Mm-hmm.
out. That particular book has been downloaded by 50,000 visitors in 138 countries.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, this in part, giving this away has led to my participation in doing Zoom lectures for individuals all over.
Mm-hmm.
I recently gave a workshop to Romanian mental health workers who were taking Ukrainian
Yeah.
victims.
Yeah.
And the work in China has been really interesting. Part of my goal there is to make sure that all the hype that comes out of Western psychology and psychotherapy does not seep its way
Mm-hmm.
into China. I want to guard them from all the bullshit that exists in the West, pardon
Yeah.
the expression. So that has been really interesting. I have, because the Melissa Institute is in
Mm-hmm.
Miami, we have dealt with people from a variety of Caribbean and South American cultures and so forth. I've had projects with Native Indian populations
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. So I'm really very culturally minded. And I think the combination of my work on cognitive behavior therapy and my sensitivity to cultural factors have led me to be invited to conduct this training
Mm-hmm.
in China.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful.
Here's the best part.
Mm-hmm.
I recently had the Chinese therapist sing happy birthday to me in Chinese.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love it.
Oh, that's funny. I'm going to ask
That's
you a
my claim to
question.
fame.
That's awesome. Yeah, your joy and interest in working with different populations
Mm-hmm.
knows no ends. I'd like to ask you, what have you observed culturally about the stigma
Yes.
of mental health in the West and in the East? And I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts there.
Well, they're all marked variability. So some individuals are really living in a goldfish bowl. Both there are more differences within a culture than there are between cultures. That's really quite interesting. One of the things I've come to appreciate, I'll get directly to your question, but one of the things I came to appreciate is that clinical problems are pretty uniform across cultures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in China, okay, most of the therapists I'm training are female, and they're female in their 20s, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as I pointed out to them, they all have Jewish mothers, even though they're in China, because their mother wants to know when they're getting married, when they're going to have a baby. It's It's a uniform kind of problem. When domestic violence occurs all over, people are exposed to natural and other kinds of traumatic experiences. So within each culture, there is often a stigma, an avoidance of other people knowing that they are seeking help.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want to characterize it as West versus East per se. One could find in many small towns in the United States, which are called goldfish bowls, where everybody knows everybody, where avoidance of seeking help or avoidance of having that go public is noted. I'm not sure if I'm getting close to your concerns. Clearly, the West is more individually oriented, and the East is much more group oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And the issues of trust, expectations vary across cultures. For example, in China, a community might be locked down because of COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and you are confined to your house. Now, if you deviate and go out of the house, significant others in that building or family members may even report you to authorities, right? So, a really interesting question is if you go to see a therapist and you happen to be gay in China, do you trust the therapist not to report you to the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
authorities? Whereas here, the notion is whatever I talk to my therapist will stay within that room. So the notion of therapeutic alliance, trust, and so forth may vary across
Yeah.
cultures, depending upon all of the other kinds of societal uh,
Mm-hmm.
expectations. Um, and it's been proven to me to be a real challenge in the training of therapists, degree to which the client feels that they could trust for them. The same thing would apply to your
Mm-hmm.
addictions treatment. You wouldn't want anyone else, like your employer or others, to know about your problem. So you may be very sensitive as to whether you can really share this relation, whether you may have experienced some trauma from a family member, and you want to make sure that the therapist is not going to go public
Yeah.
with that
Mm-hmm.
information. I think this is a uniform problem in the area of
Mm-hmm.
psychotherapy.
Yeah. What would you say therapists should do to tailor those core tasks of psychotherapy to meet the needs of such diverse populations?
Well, at least in my own domain, I try to explain to the patient early on in treatment what we know about psychotherapy. I actually have a conversation with the patient that the research indicates that the degree of fit between me and the patient is critical. That how well they feel heard, understood, the degree to which we could mutually engage in kind of hopeful
Mm-hmm.
solutions to their problems is critical. Therefore, I will be asking you, the patient, on a session by session basis to please share with me, the therapist, how well we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to know I will be as honest as possible as a therapist, but I expect you, the patient, to also have a mutual transaction of being honest with me on how
Mm-hmm.
it's going. Does this make
Yes,
sense to you?
absolutely. Yeah.
So I convey to the client, does this make
Mm-hmm.
sense to him or her in order that they can understand why we need to have a transparent interaction. I'm sure your colleague here had that opportunity with regard to his therapist that made such a big impact early on,
Mm-hmm.
that you can sort of be able to tell the therapist when they're way off, when
Yeah.
they're way on, whether you see them as being helpful or not,
Right. That
and the like.
correction element is so important. And I think it's so valuable to encourage the ability for the client to speak to that, right? And to say, okay, no, I am not on track,
Right.
or yes, I am on track, or this is what I need to focus on more of. Cliff, I see you nodding your head. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
yeah. I should warn you that in about 10 minutes, I have my
Okay, not a
physiotherapist
problem.
coming.
Not a problem. We'll do a couple more questions.
I recently had
Oh, I'm
heart
so
failure,
sorry to hear
and
that.
they're now doing this
Yeah, I'm
treatment.
glad
Yeah,
that I mean, you yourself are in recovery right now as well. And yeah,
I sure am. Yeah, I sure am. 2 months ago, my heart
oh
stopped
my
for 14
goodness.
minutes.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so I try to live
I
resilience.
I would yeah, I'm so glad that you're, here still and sharing with us all of this valuable information. What would you say you would recommend for therapists to do to continue to develop their expertise and remain effective? And what should clients look for
Well,
their
you know,
therapist doing?
I without shooting my horn, before I had
Mm-hmm.
this heart failure, I finished two
Mm-hmm.
legacy courses, each
Mm-hmm.
for 10 hours. And if your listening audience goes to www.melissainstitute, all
Mm-hmm.
one word,
Mm-hmm.
.org, they will be able to register for my legacy
Okay.
courses. And in these, the first 10 are the core task of
Mm-hmm.
psychotherapy. The second 10 is how to apply these core tasks to specific clinical
Mm-hmm.
populations, individuals who have PTSD or substance abuse or anger problem. There's a whole section there on how to integrate spirituality and psychotherapy,
Yeah.
which is a
Wonderful.
major domain.
Mm-hmm.
And I would encourage your listeners, if they want more of the same, to go to the Melissa Institute and register for the courses. Each are 10 hours long, and I should let your audience know that the proceeds of the 10 courses are going to the Melissa Institute, not to me directly, in memory of my deceased
Mm-hmm.
wife. We were married for 58
Wow.
years, and she deserves a great deal of credit for all that I have achieved. Thank you for your interest and information, and I hope this is helpful to your audience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Meichenbaum. It really is an honor.
Dr. Meichenbaum, again, as someone in long-term recovery, and I've built a recovery program that is working for me today, and hopefully that continues. As I mentioned, part of it was the 12 steps, but a big part of it also was positive psychology.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Martin Seligman
Right.
and his work with the PERMA framework. And it's interesting that it's a relatively new field, late 90s, 2000 ish. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, an intentional approach to designing a life high in well being. I know that there's some of the traditional psychologists that came up through the 60s and 70s. There's different opinions on positive psychology. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, very quickly, there's an overlap between the kind of core tasks that I enumerate in my Roadmap to Resilience book and some of the techniques that are evident in positive psychology. That's really a chapter heading, positive psychology. So a lot of different things fall under it. And this is where I think the hype becomes a
Mm-hmm.
critical issue. Let me give you one example. There is a kind of advocation of treatment called mindfulness training,
Yep. Yep.
right? Well, it turns out that George Bonanno, who's written a book called
Mm-hmm.
The End of Trauma, has reviewed the studies that indicate that mindfulness actually make people
Yep.
worse.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, the question is, do positive psychologists just, well, there's the EMDR.
Hmm.
Everybody points to 96 different things you could do. I recently critiqued, if you go on to the hype articles, some of the work of Bessel van der Kolk. His book has been on the New York Times bestseller, The Body Keeps Score, for 200 weeks. Well, it turns out there isn't as much substance to what he offers as others. So, under positive psychology, there are certain things that may work, others don't. I would take it with a grain of salt and not really just follow all of the guides therein. Go to my consumer's guide article on how to spot hype and see if the positive psychology advocates are in fact exaggerating their claims of efficacy, whether they have gurus who endorse it, whether they're thick, thin skinned, whether there's any evidence for it. I can go on and on. This is my favorite topic, is to get people to be critical consumers.
Yeah.
So in the same way that you are able to identify certain kinds of sponsors who are helpful versus those who aren't, they all fall under sponsorship is something everyone should have. Well, it depends on the sponsor. Yeah, so my attitude is be a critical consumer.
Yeah.
Don't just accept other people's endorsements.
Yeah.
What a privilege. Thank you so much. It was great to meet you.
Okay.
Okay, take care.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Recovery.com podcast. For additional information, resources, and to access treatment options, please visit our website at Recovery.com. We appreciate your listenership and are excited to have you join us on our next show coming soon.